Masechet Gittin Daf Kaf Bet. Today we have two topics. First, about perforated flower pots, and the second one is about different types of parchment prepared in different ways. So we begin with the perforated flower pot, which is always an interesting test case because on the one hand, it's soil, things grow out of it, and it has a hole on the bottom, and from that hole, the plant can get nutrients from the ground, so it's somewhat connected to the ground. It can even grow a root right through that hole in it. On the other hand, it's a movable object because you can take it and move it from place to place. So it's a fun case to test out different theories. So kitavo al cheres shel asis nakub kasher deshakel leviahib le nihala. If someone writes a get on the clay pot of a perforated plant, a pot in a perforated pot, but you actually write it on the clay itself, that is a kosher valid get because the husband can take the entire pot and give it to his wife, and it's a pot, and so he's giving it to her, so there's no problem there. Why would you think it's a problem? I mean, because we said you can't write it on a tree, on a leaf, on something attached to the ground, but even though this pot is on the ground when you're writing it, and then you're picking it up, so you might say, well, it's kind of attached to the ground. But no, we don't say that because it's just one action. You're picking it up and giving it to her, so it's not considered that you're doing an action in between, so that's fine. Al aleh shel asis nakub. Abaye amar kasher v'Rabba amar pasul. Abaye amar kasher deshakel leviahib le nihala. But what if you write it on a leaf on a plant that's in a perforated pot that's on the ground? So Abaye says that's also fine. It's the same as writing it on the clay pot itself. You're writing it on the leaf, but even though the leaf is part of a living thing, well, I mean, not a living being like an animal, it's part of an item that is growing, and it's kind of attached to the ground in the sense that it has a hole, but the same as before, you can just pick up the whole thing and giving it. It's one action of taking and giving. That's not called an action in between, so it's fine, it's a valid get. However, Rava amar pasul gezerah shema yiktom. Rava says, no, this looks too much like a different case where it's really attached to the ground. You can't write on a leaf that's attached to the ground because it's because it's attached to the ground, and you have to add another step. We saw yesterday, says v'chatab and then v'natan, that there has to be no action intervening between the writing and the giving. And if you have to cut off the leaf, then that's an added action. And so in this case also, even though, yes, if you would be very careful to take the entire plant and give it to her, then that would be fine. But we have a gezerah because you're going to say, well, you know what, maybe I don't want to give the entire plant. Let me just rip off the leaf and give it to her. But in that case, that is an added action, that it was connected. I'm ripping it off and then giving it to her, and that would be no good. So therefore, he says the entire situation, even if you give her the whole pot, one should not do that. Okay, now since we talked about potted plants, let's go further into this discussion. Asis shel echad uzra'im shel acher, machar ba'al asis leba'al zera'im, kevan shemashach kana. Now this has nothing to do with a get. This is just about how can you acquire, transfer ownership of a potted plant, a perforated pot that has a plant in it. The difficulty is there's two different ways of acquiring items. Things that don't move, like land, you acquire them in several ways. You can with a document, with money, or with chazakah. Chazakah means that you're going to do something to the ground. You work the ground, plant something, plow, right? Work the ground. That's a way of acquiring it. Whereas movable items are a different set of ways that you can acquire it, and one way is by pulling it, right? You have an animal or a car, or a chair, right? By pulling it, that's how you effectuate the transfer of ownership. So here's the question regarding a potted plant. Is it like land because it's potted and it has a hole in it, so it's connected to the ground? Or is it like a movable item because you can pick it up and move it? So first we have a case of two people that own it together. They share ownership of this potted plant, and now they want to transfer the half ownership all to one person. So if you have the pot belongs to one person and the plant belongs to another person, if the one who owns the pot sells it to the one who owns the plant, right? So he's basically selling the clay pot. Well, a clay pot is a movable item. So once the person who owns the plant moves it, then he collects it. So for the pot, we can consider that a movable item. But the other way around, machar bal zarim lebal asis, if the one who owns the plant is going to sell the plant to the one who owns the pot, lo kana ad sheyachzik bazeraim, then it's not enough just to move the plant, because this is soil that's connected through the hole to the ground and therefore is considered like land, and you cannot you acquire land by pulling it. Usually you don't have to say that because you can't pull the ground, but in this case you need to say that. So even though it's something that you can move, because it's in a pot but still considered attached to the ground, so it's not considered like a movable object, but rather like land. And so therefore the person that's acquiring the plant, the one who owns the pot is acquiring the plant, he has to do a little work. He has to take a weed out, do some raking in that pot. And that's how he acquires it, through chazakah. Next case. Asis uzra'im shel achad umechadan le'acher. What if one person owns both the pot and the plant, and he wants to sell the entire thing to someone else? Hechezik bazra'im kana asis. So if the buyer then does a chazakah and plucks out some weeds or does some work with the soil, so he acquires not only the plant but also the pot. וזוהי ששנינו נכסים שאין להם אחריות נקנים עם נכסים שיש להם אחריות בכסף ובשטר ובחזקה. And this is what the Mishnah teaches in Masechet Kiddushin, that if you have property that does not serve as a guarantee, that means movable items, can be acquired along with agav, property that can serve as a guarantee. Land can serve as a guarantee on the loan, if you do give kesef, shtad, or chazakah. In other words, let's say a typical case: I'm selling land, and there's a lawn chair on the land, and so if I sell you the land in a way that land can be sold, can be transferred with money or a document or chazakah, you do some work on the land. Since you acquire the land, you also acquire the movable objects that are connected to the land, that are on the land. And so in this case also, since you're doing, I'm giving you the plant, and you acquire the plant by doing some work on the plant, so you acquire the movable item, the pot, along with it, even though the pot is not on it, but actually the land is in the pot, but it's the same thing. It transfers along with it. However, hechazik ba'asis, af asis lo kana ad sheyachazik bazeraim. But if the buyer took possession of the pot, like if he pulled it, then he does not get anything. He certainly doesn't get the land, because land needs to be acquired through one of those other ways, and he doesn't even get the pot, because my whole point is I'm selling you both, the whole thing together, and so therefore it doesn't work. He has to actually do some chazakah on the plant itself in order to acquire it. This case now is not about ownership or transfer of ownership, but rather about the status of a plant, whether it belongs to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore would you have to give Terumot and Ma'asrot, or outside of Eretz Yisrael, in which case you wouldn't. So you have a perforated pot, and the pot is the whole of the pot is in the land of Israel. So therefore, any roots that it has, any sustenance from the soil is from the soil of Israel. However, it is growing. It's right on the border of Israel, and the growth, the branches and the fruits are growing outside the land of Israel. So what's the status? Abaye said, Abaye amar batar nikvo azlinan, Rava amar batar nofo azlinan. Abaye says we go by where the hole is, the perforation, because according to him, the sustenance from the soil is the primary sustenance, and so that's what the fruit goes by, and so it's required to give to the Mota Masrot. Rava, however, says no, we follow the branches, the airspace. It's growing in the airspace. That's where the fruit actually is, and so you do not have to bring to the Mot and Maasrot. So that's actually quite an interesting machloket. It's interesting in terms of law, but also in terms of the biology of how trees grow. And even today, a lot of people think that where's the mass of the trees actually come from? A lot of people think it actually comes from the soil, that the soil's growing up and moving up into the tree. But a long time ago, someone did an experiment and had a potted plant, and on the scale with weights on the other. And as the tree grew and grew, he measured the soil before and measured just the soil after, and found that the soil almost remained the same, even though the tree grew a lot. And so the answer is that the bulk of the mass of the tree comes not from the soil, but rather right out of thin air. The tree, through photosynthesis, is able to take carbon dioxide, split it to carbon and oxygen. Oxygen goes back into the air. Carbon, that is what a tree is primarily made out of, carbon and then water. So actually, both do have a good point. Abaye is saying it goes by the soil, and some of the nutrients do in fact come from the soil, but the vast majority of the trees, of any plant's mass, actually does come from the air. So the airspace. That's what Rava says. All right. Now, bida ashrush kula amala plige ki plige bidela ashrush. If the pot actually took root, and it has a root coming through that hole into the land of Israel, so then the Gemara says actually in that case they all would agree that it goes by the status of the roots, and it would be considered part of Israel in a case like this. But the question, their machloket actually is where it did not take root. So there's a hole, and the hole is in the land of Israel, but there's no root there. So there it's more questionable of whether it's significant that it happens to the soil, the base of the soil happens to be in the land of Israel. Is that significant or not? So that's what the machloket is. That's the Gemara's clarification. And now we're going to question that from a couple of sources. Is this true that when it takes root, there's no machloket? Here's two sources that talk about it taking root, and there is a machloket about it. The first one is Mishnah in Baba Metzia. V'atanan shete ginot zo al gav zo v'yarak ben taim. Rabbi Meir omer shel alyon, Rabbi Yehuda omer shel tachton. We have a case of two gardens. One, an upper one, is owned by one person, and a lower one owned by somebody else. Right, so clearly these trees belong to the lower one, and these trees belong to the upper one. But there's also a tree that's growing on the wall that separates between the two gardens, and so the roots are in the upper garden, but the airspace it's growing into is the lower garden. And so here, who does this belong to? This is now for ownership. Rabbi Meir says it belongs to the upper one, and Rabbi Yehuda says it belongs to the lower one. So this is a case where clearly it is rooted into the ground, and yet there is still a machloket whether it should follow the roots or follow the airspace. So it's not true what you just said, that if it has roots, then everyone agrees it follows the roots. And so we respond to that. Hatam kedeketani tama amar Rabbi Meir ma im yirse elyon litot afaro en kan yarak. Amar Rabbi Yehuda ma im yirse hatachton lemalot et ginato afar en kan yarak. And it says no. In that case, the Tanaim give their explanations for why ownership should be for this or for that. And Rabbi Meir explains that the upper one should own it because if he wanted, he could dig out the roots and then there would be no more tree. So he can destroy the tree, so therefore it's his. And the Yehuda responds and says, wait a second, the guy with the lower one, he can fill up his land and destroy the tree that way. So actually he has the power to destroy the tree, and therefore it belongs to him. So you see that in this case, we're not we're not talking about the laws of Tirumot and Masrot and whether it gets sustenance from here or there. Rather, this is machloket about who owns it, which is dependent not on where it gets sustenance, but rather who has control, physical control over the tree. And so this is a different, unrelated machloket, and therefore we can maintain what we said before, that in a case where you have a tree that takes root in Israel, everyone would agree that you do have to bring Terumot and Ma'asrot. And now a second challenge from a Braita, V'hatanya. אילן מקצתו בארץ ומקצתו בחוץ לארץ, תבל וחולין מעורבים זה בזה דברי רבי. If you have a tree and half of the tree is in the land of Israel and half of it is outside the land of Israel, it's right on the border. So what's the status of its fruit? According to the Yehuda Nasi, it's a combination of tebel and holin. Within each fruit, there's a combination of half of this fruit, and not it's the right half, left half. It's all mixed up. 50% of the fruit of the tree, and of each fruit is tebel and requires Terumot and Masrot, and 50% of all of its produce is holin, outside the land of Israel. And since it's all mixed together, so you would have to bring Terumot and Masrot for the tree, and you would not be able to combine Terumot and Masrot with another tree that is actually totally in the land of Israel. In other words, if you have a pile of apples from within the land of Israel and you're going to take, or olives, and you're going to take Terumot and Masrot from that, you can't mix them up and take from this tree that's on the border Terumah for the other tree in one big pile, because for this one it's only 50% requirement of Terumah, and one that grows in Israel is 100% requirement. So you'd have to take Terumot and Masrot from this tree for this tree. So in a way, being half-half is actually worse. It has more restrictions. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Hagadel bechayuv chayav, Hagadel beftur patur. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, however, says, if it's on the border, then you just look. Anything that grows on this side of the tree within Israel, that you have to take to the Terumot and Masrot, and anything that grows on the other side, outside the land of Israel, you don't. So it's not all mixed up 50-50, but rather you make a line right down the middle, or whatever it is, for 25%, or wherever that line is, you split it, and that's easy to split. Now, my love miksat nofo ba'aretz miksat nofo bechutz haaretz, and aren't we talking here about a case where that the branches are half in and half out, but the root is all in one place? I'll say all in Israel, right? So that's what we're assuming. The root is all in Israel, and yet there is a machloket about the branches. Do the branches are they all mixed up, and do the branches follow the root? According to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, yes, all the branches, or at least in half of all the branches, in other words, within each and every branch, some of it is coming from Israel and some from the air, and so therefore all of it has a status of being 50%, 50% Terumot and Masrot. Whereas according to Rashbag, no, it's only the airspace, and so anything that grows from the airspace outside the land of Israel, even though the root is in Israel, it takes no nourishment. We don't care about it, and it's only considered fruit from outside the land of Israel, and so we follow the airspace and not the root. So you see, there is a machloket here in a case where it is rooted into the ground. So this is not true what you said before, that there's no machloket when it's rooted in the ground, and we should follow the root for everything. And so we answer, Lo, miksat shorashim ba'aretz, miksat shorashim b'chutz haaretz. Now, we're not talking about a case where all of the roots are in Israel, but rather where the roots themselves are also split, right? The root is half, the trunk is half on this side and half on that side, and the leaves are also half on this side, half on that side, and that's the case we're talking about. Okay, if so, my ta'amad Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, how come Rashbag thinks that half the trees on this side are Israel, and the fruit that grows on that side is not Israel? Demafsik sunama, because there's a rock in the ground that is dividing the roots. See, if there's no rock, then we assume the roots go all over the place, right? The roots go this way and that way and get all mixed up. And so then it's drawing sustenance from the ground from both places. So if it was just a regular tree that was drawing sustenance, then we would have to say, yes, all the fruit has some sustenance from Israel. But in this case, we say, we're talking about where under the ground there's a rock, and it comes up, and so therefore the roots that are on Israel's side stay on Israel's side, roots on the other side stay on the outside of Israel's side, and that as they go up the trunk, those roots and those the sap that's going up them, up within them, stay on one side and on the other, and therefore the fruit on this side is receiving sustenance from Israel, and the other fruits on the other side is not receiving any sustenance from Israel, and that's the reason that Rashbag lands his halacha. My tamad Rabbi. If so, what's the reason of Rabbi that says there's a big mixture altogether? Tehadri Rabbi, because Rabbi would say that even though the roots are separated, but once it goes in the trunk, the roots themselves intertwine and go on one side and go to the other side, and therefore even the fruits that are on one side will get sustenance from even the fruit that's on one side will get sustenance from the roots that are on the other side. So what's the essence of their machloket? Mor sabar avira mebabel, or mor sabar hay lechudeh v'hay lechudeh ka'eh. The essence of the machloket is that according to the Biuda Nasi, the air, meaning the trunk that is in the airspace, mixes everything up. Whereas Rashbag thinks that no, if you'd open up a tree, you could see that the roots follow straight through on one side, and the roots on the other side go straight through and only provide sustenance to the fruits on the other side. So that's the machloket, but this has nothing to do with a tree that is all in Israel. If the tree was all in Israel, then everyone would agree that in fact all the fruit gets some sustenance from the land of Israel, and so now we are able to maintain that thesis that if there's a perforated plant and it does have a root that goes into the ground and that's in Israel, then all of the fruit will be considered the fruit of Israel. We now go back to the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer, he said that one is not allowed to write a get on erased paper or on any unfinished leather, because that is easy to forge. I mentioned the palimpsest yesterday, and here is a picture of one particularly interesting such document where you can see the original writing on it is in Hebrew. You can see the Hebrew letters here, and then Christians would sometimes they just burnt the Talmud and Hebrew documents, but sometimes they thought better of it, and they said, why burn it when this is valuable parchment and we can reuse it? And so here you see that they wrote on top of the Hebrew writing Latin Christian writing. So luckily for us, they didn't burn it and kept it, and that way we can read not only Latin, but we can read the original Hebrew that was on it, and this is a source of a lot of valuable material. So actually we can kind of read it over time, but this is not good for a get according to the Yehuda ben Betera, because you can easily forge it by erasing and writing something else. So now that he mentioned unfinished leather, we're going to describe 3 types of unfinished leather that, according to the Yehuda ben Betera, all of them would be no good for a get. Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Aseh mishmeh de'ula shelosha oroten masa chifa v'diftera. These are 3 types of unfinished leather hides. One is called masa, one is called chifa, and one is called diftera. We're going to describe each one. Masa kemashma'o. Masa is as its plain meaning. Just like masa that you eat is unfinished bread, didn't have a chance, you don't give it a chance to rise, so too this is hide that's very plain and is not fully processed. Delo maliach udela kamiach udela afis, that it's not treated with salt or flour or gallnuts. The full process is you take the hide and you remove the flesh and you put it in salt, and then you put it in flour. The fermentation of the flour helps it, and then you put the gallnut water afterwards, and that helps it keep the ink permanently. Here you did none of that. Now, why are we even bothering to mention that there is such a thing called masa? Lehosa'at Shabbat. We need to know this regarding carrying on Shabbat. In order to be liable for carrying on Shabbat, it's not enough just to carry a tiny nothing that's not useful. If you carry something very small that's not useful, then one is not liable on Shabbat. So there's a minimum amount for every different type of item. What's the minimum size of something that would be useful? So regarding this masa, what's the minimum size that it would be useful to have this much leather, and therefore you'd be liable for carrying it? It's to wrap a small weight. They had weights in those days, either to measure whatever different things. If you're buying some precious metals, so you have a little weight, and the weight itself can, if you keep rubbing it and touching it and moving it, some of the material can rub away. So they'd wrap the weight in some leather to protect it. So a very small weight, enough leather to wrap a very small weight. V'chama, how small of a weight? A quarter of litra in the weights used in pumpedita. It's a very small weight. If someone carries enough matzah leather to wrap such a weight, then they would be liable. Second step is chifa demliach vela kemiach vela afis. This is hide that's salted but not treated with flour or with gallnuts. Lemay hilcheta, and why are we mentioning chipa? What halacha does it relate to? Again, the hosat Shabbat. V'chama shiuro kiditnan or kedei la'asot kamiya. This is for the minimum size on Shabbat. And how much is that size? If you carry it, it's enough of this chifa to write a kamiya. And if you're writing an amulet, you can't write it on the worst type, but you don't need the best type of leather. So you would write a kamiya on this. How big is a kamiya? Well, big enough to write the basic formula of a kamiya. If someone carries that much chifa leather, then they would be liable. Diftera de malechu kamiach vela afis. Diftera is the next step, that you salted it and treated with flour, but not with gallnuts. Lemay hilcheta. And why is it important to mention diftera? For what halacha is it relevant? Again, lehosat Shabbat v'chama shiuro kedei lichtov alav et haget. Enough leather to write a get. We saw yesterday, right? The size of a get is basically one paragraph. You can write small. So if someone carries that much diftera, then they would be liable on Shabbat. Now, this source here is following Rabbanan, Chachamim Machshirim. They disagree with Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, and they say that one can write a get on diftera. So this source is talking about because even though it's erasable, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera would disagree with this and say, no, it cannot write on diftera because you didn't put the gallnut water. Rather, it has to be fully processed in order to use for a get for Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. All right, so now let's go into Chachamim Machshirin. They say you can use erased paper and unfinished leather. So this is strange, but aren't we worried that someone can come and maybe there's a condition in the get, and then someone will come later and erase the condition or put something else, right? Here's your divorce paper on condition that you owe me, that you give me $100, and someone comes and just erases $100 and writes $1,000. So this could make a big difference. So how could this be allowed? Man chachamim amar Rabbi Elazar he damar ede mesira karte. So Rabbi Elazar, the Amora, that's Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, says that this the Chachamim in the Mishnah are Rabbi Elazar the Tana, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, who says that the primary witnesses that effectuate the divorce are the witnesses that see the giving of the get from the husband to the wife. And so therefore what's written in the get is less important, because you have witnesses that are there and they will read the get, they will know what's in it, they will witness the transfer, and then you can go and ask them, hey, what did you read? What was in the get? So therefore, even if someone comes afterwards and changes some words, that will not be a make or break, because we're not relying so much on the document itself, because at the time that it was transferred, the witnesses saw it, and so they can verify what had been in the get. Ve'amar Rabbi Elazar, lo hichshir Rabbi Elazar ela le'altan. Rabbi Elazar the Amora says that Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua only said that it's okay if you use that if she verifies the get immediately. In other words, she goes to the Bet Din with those witnesses that saw its transfer, and the witnesses will tell the Bet Din, hey, listen, this is what we saw, and the Bet Din then will record that she is divorced and record whatever other conditions are in it. But if it's later, not immediate, but if it's tomorrow, 2 days, 10 days, or more, then this is not valid, because we have to suspect that maybe there was in fact a condition written in the get, and someone changed it. Maybe she changed it, and now by that time, after a long time, the witnesses are going to forget what they had seen. So therefore, you have to, according to the Rabbi Elazar, you have to use it. She has to bring it and the witnesses to the Bet Din immediately, and that's the only way that this is valid. But according to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua the Tana, he says that Rabbi Elazar, who is the Chachamim in the Mishnah, say afilu mikan ad asara yamim timita dahava betenai midkar dechiri. Even many days later, the get is still valid, because if there had been a condition in it, the witnesses would remember, and so even after a while, you can bring the witnesses and say, here, they remember that it said in the document that he has to pay $100. If she's the one that's forging it, then maybe it said $1,000, and then she changes it to $100. Okay, but the witnesses will remember. No, it wasn't I remember it wasn't 100. I remember it was 1,000. So Rabbi Yochanan doesn't give that strict time limit. Amar ve'amar Rabbi Elazar lo ichshir Rabbi Elazar ela b'gitin aval b'shashtarot lo dichtiv untatem b'kli chares leman yamdu yamim rabim. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat says that Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua in the Mishnah only permits using erasable paper or unfinished leather regarding a get. So we'll be more lenient regarding a get to help out the woman in case it's difficult to find proper parchment. But in other documents, you cannot do that. And the proof is from Yirmiyah, when Yirmiyah is told to go and buy a piece of land. This is right before the destruction of Beit HaMikdash. Go buy land. And so buy land, the whole place is being destroyed. And the point is, don't worry, buy land, because the Jewish people are going to come back. And so, yes, it's a good investment. And there it says, you should put it in a kli cheres. Take the document that you write, put it in an earthenware vessel, so that it will remain for a long time. And in fact, this is true. We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them that were in clay jars lasted in good condition until today. Those that were not kept in clay jars all fell apart. So you see from here that this is a financial document. This is a deed of sale, and it has to last a long time. And so this leniency that you can just rely on the witnesses and use forgeable paper, we'll use that for a get. But for any other document, the document has to last a long time, and therefore you cannot use any paper that can be forged, that can be erased. So that's what Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, Ben Pedat says. However, Rabbi Yochanan interprets Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat differently and says, this is what Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat says, right, regarding Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. However, Rabbi Yochanan interprets Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua differently and says, afilu bishtarot, he says even in other documents, that's fine. You can use unfinished leather. And even though the Pasuk says in Yirmiyah, so that it will last a long time, and unfinished leather, you cannot trust it for a long time because it's easy to erase, and who knows where the witnesses are going to be after a long time. Rabbi Yochanan says, but that Pasuk is giving good advice. Hashem is telling Yirmiyah, put it in a clay jar, and write it good so that it will last a long time. It's good advice for you because you're the buyer, and maybe in many decades from now, someone will contest it, and you want to have a document that lasts a long time. So it's good advice for you. You should do it, but it doesn't mean that it's necessary. And even if you write it on unfinished parchment that can be erased, it's still a valid document. But it's simply a good idea, but not halachically necessary to write it in a permanent way. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.